It's time to go on a great hunt. The White Scars are here, and they're as speedy as a thunderbolt. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the tactics-based 40k channel, where we're currently all about the Adeptus Astartes and the ways to field them on the tabletop. In this review we'll be taking a look at the White Scars Codex. We'll go through every rule in the book at a fairly speedy pace, including the chapter tactic, boosted doctrine, warlord traits, relics, psychic powers, and the all-important stratagems. And after that we'll look at an example White Scars army list that puts into practice some of the strongest tricks in the book in my opinion. And as we go along I'll let you know my opinions on whether or not each individual thing is worth taking. Now, the White Scars are the 5th Legion of Space Marines, and they're essentially a horde of Mongols clad in white power armour in space. They quite like to ride their bikes about, and they're famed for their lightning fast hit and run attacks, which are now reflected pretty well in the fluff, what with their chap's tactic allowing them to jump back after assault. Their Primarch is Jagatai Khan. They come from the homeworld of Chogoris, and a lot of their named characters in the fluff are also Khans, such as kor'sarro Khan. The updated sculpt for the Primaris version of this guy, Games Workshop have just released. Let's see what the rules of these guys are all about then. Their chapter tactic is called Lightning Assault, and this allows units with the chapter tactic to assault again in any turn that they advanced or fell back. And biker models with this tactic don't suffer the penalty for moving and firing heavy weapons or for advancing and firing assault weapons. So there are a few bits to this tactic, starting with the weaker elements, the biker parts. I believe that the biker models moving and firing with heavy weapons only applies to attack bikes under normal circumstances, so it's a very small damage increase to the heavy bolter or multi-melter mounted on the attack bike. Unfortunately, attack bikes don't have the best rules at the moment, so I'm not sure that this will see very much play. The benefits for advancing and firing assault weapons with bikes usually applies to scout bikes and their shotguns. Now, scout bikes are fairly fragile as a unit, but they are quite good in terms of damage output. The problem with them though is that a lot of their damage output comes from the bolters mounted on their bikes, so it's a lot better most of the time to just move them normally, fire off their bolter weapons, and also still fire their assault weapons. Hopefully they will be in range. This does give them the option of getting some firepower when they advance if they are looking to be able to make use of the advance and charge rule. Now, the actual main part of the tactic, being able to advance and charge or fall back and charge, is a lot more useful. It means that bikers with their automatic 6-inch advance will be able to pull off a 20-inch move, I believe, before charging in, so could easily allow for some first turn charges if desired. Advancing and charging can also be very good on the slower units, say things like assault centurions and aggressors, which really massively adds to their threat range of being able to assault things, as they have such limited moves normally. With average dice, it means an assault centurion will be able to charge something that is 14 inches away rather than about 10 inches away without this tactic, so it really does increase their threat range quite significantly. Now, I don't think fallback and charging is going to be used as much, but when it does get to be used, it's going to be critical. If you have a unit that makes it to the enemy lines, and it charges something durable that it can't kill, your opponent doesn't have the option to just leave that unit in combat and forget about whichever one of your units charged. Being able to fall back and charge again can gain you an enormous amount of mobility, as you can dance out of combat and then pick the optimal charge for your unit. It could be particularly powerful, say, on a smash captain, so that's a captain with a jump pack and a nasty close combat weapon, where you could jump back 12 inches out of combat and set up for another nasty charge on another unit. Basically, fall back and charge means that your opponent really doesn't want to have your units running around in their lines, and will force them to actually have to deal with every unit that gets into their deployment zone. They can't afford to ignore it. Overall, as a tactic, it's not too bad. I found the advance and charge a lot more useful than the fall back and charge. But to be honest, the strength of the White Scars comes from their relics, psychic powers and stratagems, which we'll get onto in a bit. Secondly, we'll talk about their boosted doctrine, which for the White Scars is called Devastating Charge. Now, this is a buff to the assault doctrine, which has its drawbacks, but it is very, very powerful. Essentially, every time one of your units makes a charge in the turn, or performs a heroic intervention, you add 1 to the damage characteristic of all the weapons that unit is fighting with. Now, this is assault doctrine, and unfortunately there's no way to make the assault doctrine come on faster. It will be turn 3 at maximum, which is, in all honesty, the biggest downside of this. I'll be talking a little bit more about combat doctrines in the video I'm planning for tomorrow, so feel free to check back then if that's a discussion that would interest you. Now, adding 1 to the damage characteristics of every weapon on the turn you make a charge is absolutely massive. It really turns up your fighty characters to another level, and you can already build some strong characters with this supplement, as we'll see. It's also great on Terminators, as on the charge those power fists will be essentially damage D3 plus 1, so on average 3 damage apiece, like their mini Thunderhammers. Jump Captains with Thunderhammers can get up to damage 4, and if you give them the Mastercrafted Weapon special rule, they can be damage 5 on the charge, which in all honesty you don't really see too often. They're hitting almost as hard as a Knight does in close combat. It also could be very nice on just your standard troops, so Intercessors hitting in the Assault Doctrine will be AP-1 of course, and damage 2. So if you do get a charge off with a full squad of these boys, you'll be hitting with 32, strength 4, AP-1, damage 2 attacks, which is basically going to do some damage to whatever enemy unit you throw it at. You'll just decimate troops, put a real hurt on medium infantry, and even vehicles will feel the effects of that massively boosted damage. Another very solid option for White Scars is Vanguard Veterans, particularly if you equip them with 2 chainsaws, which I believe that you can still do, which means that each Vanguard Veteran on the charge will be getting 5 of these AP-1, strength 4, damage 2 attacks, and that's before you apply any buffs to the unit, and you certainly can apply buffs if you should so wish. I feel that this doctrine is best used on units that you can keep safe till turn 3, say for example like that Terminator squad that's hiding off the board, or Vanguard Veterans that can deep strike and charge. White Scars are also particularly good for this because one of their stratagems will allow a boosted charge out of deep strike, which is very nice indeed. Let's have a quick chat about the 2 character datasheets that are in this book. I've already covered kor'sarro Khan in his own mini tactics video, which I'll put a link to now up in the top right hand corner of the screen. The Cliff Notes version of this is that he is a decently fighty Primaris captain model that can give a +1 to wound aura to nearby White Scars units. This can just be hilarious with a bunch of low strength attacks, such as those intercessor ones that we talked about, as they could be wounding things like rhinos and other toughness 7 vehicles on 4s, boosted AP and boosted damage. My main concern with him is being able to get him into position, as he is on foot, so ideally you'd probably want a impulsor or repulsor to transport him in, or potentially just keep him central and drop down a unit from reserve in range of him. The second datasheet in the book is a non-unique character, the Khan on bike, so you could field multiple of these if you so wished. It represents a fairly ancient Games Workshop kit that until now has been a Space Marine captain with a power lance in the index and previous codex. I think it's quite cool he's got his own little datasheet now and gets some boosted rules as part of the White Scars. Now he's an HQ choice for the White Scars and has essentially the same profile as a Space Marine captain on bike. 14-inch move, 2 up weapon skill and ballistic skill, strength 4, toughness 5, 6 wounds, 4 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3 up save. He costs 100 points and is armed with a twin bolt gun, a Khan spear and frag and crack grenades. The Khan spear usually has just a strength of user, AP-3 and D3 damage, but when he charges he gets twice the strength that he normally would have, so it's essentially a power sword with D3 damage when he's fighting normally, and a power fist that ignores the modifier to hit when he's charging. He has all the normal Space Marine special rules, the Rights of Battle rule as essentially a captain, so he gives a reroll 1's aura within 6 inches. He has an Iron Halo for a 4-up invulnerable save, and he's got one more special rule called a Buckler, which I believe represents that little shield he has, which adds +1 to his save in close combat. It's not bad to have if you're fighting against a horde, but most actual serious melee threats will be at least AP-2, so he'll be using his invulnerable save anyway. Just to note, the Buckler does not affect his invulnerable save, it's just his regular armor save. Overall, I'd say he's a reasonable alternative to a Space Marine captain on bike. The Khan Spear is a pretty nice close combat weapon, as usually the round that matters in close combat the most will be the one when he charges or heroically intervenes. I'd say he's quite similar in terms of stat line to, say, a Space Marine captain on bike with a power fist. He has a few advantages, but some disadvantages. On the whole, despite that little buckler being an additional, I would probably take the captain on bike with a power fist over this guy. Partly because while his melee is a little worse than this guy on the charge, at least it's on all the time, so if you get charged or you have to fight another round of close combat, then he'll still have decent strength 8 attacks. Also, the captain on bike can also take a Stormbolter, which doubles his shooting for only 2 points, or instead of that, you could take a Storm Shield, which would massively upgrade his durability. So in my eyes, the captain on bike with a Power Fist wins out over this chap. But if you want to go a bit fluffy, there's absolutely nothing wrong with including him in your army. It's a very, very close pick. I'm sure you'll get some respect on the tabletop for bringing this guy out, as he's an interesting, cool model. So now we're on to Warlord Traits. The first is Deadly Hunter. When your Warlord charges, roll a dice, and on a 4-up, the unit he has charged suffers 1 mortal wound. Pretty awful, this one, to be honest. Much better to buff his considerable close combat, say with a trait such as the Imperium Sword from the rulebook, or one of the other fighty White Scars traits. Next we have Chogorian Storm. Now this is much better. This is plus 1d3 attacks whenever he makes a charge or a heroic intervention. So for most captains with 4 attacks, this will be on average a flat 50% buff to his damage output in close combat. That's very, very nice indeed. It certainly competes with the Imperium Sword which I just mentioned, which is plus 1 strength and plus 1 attack, particularly in some cases where you already have good strength. Say with a Thunderhammer, this could definitely be a lot better. So worth considering if you're building up a unit as a really fighty, nasty smash captain. Next we have Trophy Taker. This is plus 1 attack every time the Warlord kills an enemy character, and that lasts until the end of the game. This is kor'sarro Khan's trait, and this is pretty awful, to be honest. Killing an enemy character is by no means guaranteed. If they manage to kill an enemy character, then they've already somewhat done their job, and they might just be shot straight back off the table. Definitely don't take this, take Chogorian Storm instead, as that will start you on average with D3 attacks, without bothering to have to go character hunting. kor'sarro Khan comes with this one, and you can't change it for anything else, so it's a compelling argument not to make him your Warlord. Next we have Master Rider. This is for a biker Warlord only, so a Khan on bike or a captain on bike. This guy gets to reroll charges, and he's -1 to hit if he advanced. This is actually really quite a nice way to make your Warlord both more survivable and to reliably get him into combat more often. The only reason he'd not want to advance would be to fire off the twin bolters on the bike, which is a minor loss, but it's not really going to compare with reliably getting a very fighty character exactly where he wants to go. So if you take this one, you should pretty much always advance, and you'll be moving 20 inches per turn and then have a rerollable charge. So this chap should be able to charge who he wants. Like I said, it's great on the Khan on bike. You could also take, say, a Smash Captain on a bike with a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, and that will be a very hard threat for your opponent to remove, with -1 to hit, toughness 5, and a 3-up invulnerable save. This is definitely an option to think about, and a good reason to consider a bike leader for a White Scars army. Next we have Hunter's Instincts. That's +1 to hit and wound against a vehicle or monster. Now this one is a specific sort of close combat buff, but in the right circumstances it is absolutely amazing. Let's consider this on a jump pack captain with a Thunderhammer charging into a knight. He'll have 5 attacks on the charge with Shock Assault. Let's assume he isn't in the Assault Doctrine yet because it's turn 1 or turn 2, so he's at AP -3 and damage of flat 3. Without the trait, this averages us 4.5 damage from 1 round of fighting, but with this trait, it averages just over 8 damage in 1 round of fighting, so that is an absolutely incredible buff. It's around about 80% extra damage. It's particularly nice on things like Thunderhammers and Power Fists because it cancels out that unpleasant negative modifier, and means he'll be wounding virtually everything in the game on 3s and anything below toughness 8 on 2s, obviously provided it's a vehicle or a monster. This can also be combined with relics, for example giving the relic for +1 damage. If you do happen to charge a knight with this buff, the mastercrafted weapon Thunderhammer, in a White Scars boosted assault phase, then on average you do 16 wounds to said knight, which is just hilarious, and if you choose to fight again, then you're easily killing a knight in close combat in a turn. Obviously you do have to wait for turn 3 for that combo to go off, but that could be a big swing in the game at that point. So yes, I very much like Hunter's Instincts. This is a good one to tailor to your opponent, so say if you've seen the army, you can use the Stratagem Hero of the chapter to give one of your other characters that isn't your Warlord a Warlord trait. So you could choose this one on a Smash Captain if you happen to see that you're facing knights or something else that has a lot of vehicles or monsters. Now enough talking about that one. Let's move on to the one that has even more people excited, which is Master of Snares. This Warlord trait allows you to roll a dice when an opponent tries to fall back from you, and on a 4-up, the model cannot fall back, it must remain in close combat. And as you roll this dice, you can choose to command re-roll that, so if you expend a CP, then there's a 3/4 chance of your opponent not being able to fall back from your Warlord. Now this is very, very powerful, and has a number of different uses. Say you've got a fighty tooled up combat character that has just charged into the enemy and killed an enemy unit. You then use your consolidate move to bump into another enemy unit, say a squad of infantry guardsmen. Their attacks are too weak to be much use against your fighty character, so they will likely try and fall back in your next movement phase. If you can prevent them falling back with this trait, then it means that your opponent's army is not going to be able to shoot your character because it's in combat within 1 inch of one of their friendly models. So this just means that your tooled up character could be entirely safe from reprisals unless they have some other way of dealing with the character, such as a scary close combat unit of their own, or something that does mortal wounds such as smite. As your White Scars, you can now leave that combat next turn and then charge whatever you like. With the good movement range on jump captains or bike captains, you should now be able to engage virtually whatever you want out of the enemy's army. Another great use for this is piling into a unit that's going to do a lot of damage in the shooting phase next turn. Say if you manage to pile into a enemy tank, such as one of those repulsor executioners that can do a ton of damage in its shooting phase. If you prevent that from falling back, it will be very unhappy indeed, as it's not going to do anything much in the combat phase, but by stopping it from falling back, even though it has the fly keyword and would usually be able to shoot normally, it won't be able to shoot at all due to it being in combat, and then it will have to get hit again by your close combat character in the enemy fight phase. I'd say that this tactic is best combined with a storm shield to make your character as tanky as possible, as the enemy is likely to try and countercharge, as the easiest way to deal with Master of Snares is to kill your character in the fight phase. This did used to have an effect on flyers, causing them to automatically crash and burn due to not being able to move their minimum move distance, but fortunately Games Workshop patched that because it was a little bit stupid to think that a jump pack captain is going to somehow snare a jet plane as it flies by him. I mean, he's doing quite well to snare a repulsor executioner all by himself, but a jet plane was something else. So let's move on to the relics that we can take for the White Scars. First up we have Mantle of the Stormseer, which gives you +1 to psychic tests, which isn't too exciting, but the Stormspeaking discipline is pretty good, so could be worth picking up. We have Hunter's Eye, which allows a White Scars unit within 6 inches of the bearer to gain Ignores cover on their shooting attacks, which could be potentially fairly useful on something like a Whirlwind or some other big units that you want to give this buff to. It could possibly be worth buying in against an army that you know is going to be using a lot of cover saves, such as say Raven Guard, who get their stealthy bonus for being greater than 12 inches away and always count as being in cover. Next we have Banner of the Eagle, which is available to Ancients. It gives +1 strength to friendly White Scars units within 6 inches, and obviously the Ancient would still have his Fight When You Die special rule, so this adds an extra layer of buffs to that unit. Now this is potentially very, very strong if you get this to the place it needs to be during the White Scars Assault Doctrine. We've already been talking a bit about how well Intercessors and other low strength units could do. This really puts them up even stronger. As the Ancient is a slow moving character, you could pair him up with Khan to give +1 strength and +1 to wound for units within 6 inches when they've made a charge. So now you could have Intercessors wounding Rhino tanks on 3s, which is quite funny. You could also maybe think about deep striking this with a Terminator Ancient to get the nasty +1 strength buff exactly where it needs to be. Space Marines tend to be either strength 4 or strength 8, and going up to either strength 5 or strength 9 are quite important brackets to go up to. Next we have a relic bike called Wrath of the Heavens. This upgrades a captain or Khan's bike to have a 16-inch move, and it can travel over terrain features and enemy models as if they weren't there. So there's no screening against this guy. This is definitely a fun mobility boost to a biker captain. You could combine this with the Master Rider Warlord traits to have a hilarious threat range that can also go straight through screens. When you advance with this thing, it has 22-inch move that can go straight through enemy models, so you could deliver your bike captain with a thunder hammer to exactly what he wants to be hitting. Next we have Scimitar of the Great Khan, which is a boosted power sword. It gives you strength +1, damage of 2, and it does 4 damage if you roll a 6. To be honest, with boosted power weapons, I'd usually tend to just want to pay for the power fist, as it's only a few points more than the power sword, and it will have a similar damage to these relic power weapons. I'd save the command point for something else, probably a different relic on that same character. Next we have a potentially very nice one called Plume of the Planesrunner. This lets you add +1 to advance and charge for all units within 6 inches of the model. Adding +1 to advance is great, as your units can charge after advancing, and adding +1 to the charge could be a more reliable way of getting a charge out of a unit coming out of reserve, particularly combined with any other buffs that you have, such as a chaplain or one of the White Scar stratagems that we'll come on to in a bit. And finally we have the Glaive of Vengeance, which is a upgrade on the Khan's Spear that is always strength ×2, AP -3, and D3 damage, even if it didn't charge. So what this amounts to is a power fist with +1 to hit. It's nice that it can upgrade the unique model for the White Scarves, but it's just not as good as the captain on a bike with a power fist that you use mastercrafted weapon on to make the damage of D3 +1. Adding +1 to the damage of a power fist is a 50% buff. This buff is only 25%. That's a little bit better against infantry than the power fist one, but I'd rather have the damage buff for hitting large targets on a fighty character personally. It's certainly an option, and it's worth considering for a Khan on a bike. Next we have the special issue War Gear. I did forget to mention, but the previous section was Relics of Chogoris, which are available to the White Scars, and successor chapters have to pay an additional CP to take one of those relics. These special issue War Gear items, however, can be taken by successor chapters freely. So first we have the 4 that are common to all successor chapters. We have Adamantine Mantle, a 5+ Feel No Pain save, Artificer Armor, a 2-up save and a 5+ Invulnerable save, Mastercrafted Weapon, which is +1 damage to a weapon, which like I said can get a Thunderhammer up to a hilarious 5 damage in White Scars, and Digital Weapons for a chance to inflict a mortal wound in close combat. I'd say that Mastercrafted Weapons in particular are worth considering in White Scars lists, due to the amount of close combat buffs that you can stack on a character. In addition to this, we have an Equus pattern bolt pistol, which is fun because it turns your bolt pistol into a submachine gun essentially, with pistol 5, strength 4 and AP -1. Essentially this relic will give you an extra 4 strength 4 AP -1 shots within 12 inches. It's not awful, but I think there are stronger relics out there, so you're not going to be able to fire it all that often, with its range being only 12 inches. As usual with relic bolt pistols, I'd recommend buffing your character's melee over this, as melee is usually stronger than shooting on most characters. Next we have Headtaker's Trophies for -1 leadership within 6 inches of the bearer to enemy units. I'd definitely not bother with this one. There's a whole load of armies that really don't care about leadership at all, so it's very situational, and will only lead to a model or 2 fleeing at the best of circumstances. The Stormwrath Bolts can trade out a bolter's shot for a single shot strength 7 AP -1 shot, and that shot gains D6 damage if you fire it at a monster. I'd say this isn't ideal even if you are playing against an army that has monsters. Definitely don't buy it in a standard, but if you are playing an army with a lot of monsters, you could think about spending 1 CP to upgrade one of your characters to carry this as the game starts if you have a suitable character. And finally we have the Cyber Eagle Helm, which upgrades Overwatch on units within 6 inches, can hit on a 5 or 6 in Overwatch. I'm not sure I'm the most keen on a localized Overwatch buff, because if your opponent actually cares that much about this, then they can just not charge your unit. There's also a lot of tricks to mitigate Overwatch, such as charging from out of line of sight, or just charging with something that's got such a good defensive profile he doesn't really care about your Overwatch. It could maybe be used if your opponent has absolutely no choice but to charge you head on front lines, but I suspect that this is unlikely to be the case, and if that is the case, then you might not want to let him get that charge in the first place. So yeah, I probably wouldn't take this one myself if I'm honest. Let's move on to some psychic powers, and the White Scars have a very nice psychic power discipline called Stormspeaking. First off we have Blasting Gale for Warp Charge 7. This targets an enemy unit within 18 inches. The target cannot advance, and it rolls 1 fewer dice when making charges, so typically 1d6. Interesting to compare this with Tenebrous Curse. the Obscuration discipline psychic power. So Tenebra's Curse impacts the movement of a unit as well as halving the advance and charge. This cancels the advance but lets them move at full capacity and halves the charge range. Now this definitely is an interesting one, and if your opponent has a strong melee unit that they really need to get into close combat, this is definitely a good tool to have in your toolbox. It could potentially be good, say, if your opponent has a Knight Gallant or a big horde of melee units such as Orcs. The only thing is that your Psyker does have to be quite far forward to cast this. They have to be within 18 inches of that unit, so the Psyker might be a bit exposed. On some units you could potentially combine this with the Thunderfire Cannon Tremor Shells stratagem, if you really want to make sure a unit is going basically nowhere for a whole turn. Next we have Lightning Core. This is Warp Charge 7, and it does D3 mortal wounds to the closest unit within 18 inches. Then on a 4+ you do a further mortal wound, then on a 5+ you do another one if that has been successful, and then if the 5+1 succeeds, on a 6 you do one last mortal wound. So up to a potential of 6 mortal wounds if you roll insanely well. Now provided you can actually get this power off on Warp Charge 7, then this is actually quite a good source of mortal wounds. You get the normal D3 of Smite, and a 4-up chance to get an additional one, and then small chances to get even further ones after that. So if you think you're going to be casting a lot of offensive mortal wound powers, then this one's well worth taking. You could combine it with Smite to potentially unload quite a lot of mortal wounds on the nearest units per turn. Next we have a very useful one called Ride the Wind for Warp Charge 6. This gives you +2 to charge rolls and +2 to advance rolls. The charge roll benefit is the main bonus of this, because in your psychic phase you'll already have just done the movement phase, so they won't actually get a benefit to the advance rolls until your following turn. But in any case this could be very useful on a unit that's either already on the table or something that's come in from reserve, such as say some Terminators deep striking. They fire off all their Stormbolters, you cast this on them, and then they charge on a 7. Maybe if you give your Librarian a Plume of the Plane relic, then they can charge on a 6. So that's a very, very reliable charge out of Deep Strike now. Next we have Storm Wreathed. This is a Warp Charge 6 spell that gives a friendly unit within 12 inches of the Psyker the power to not be shot on Overwatch when they charge this turn, and it gives them the chance to inflict a mortal wound on the charge. So every friendly model that finishes the charge within 1 inches of an enemy model, you roll a dice and on a 6 it inflicts a mortal wound. I wouldn't get too hung up about the mortal wounds thing, but cancelling Overwatch on a charging unit could be massive, particularly if it's something fairly fragile such as Vanguard veterans that want to be charging some scary enemy target. Again, this is a great combo with units coming in from reserve, so you could cast Storm Wreathed and Ride the Wind on them for a very nice charge out of reserve that won't be afflicted by Overwatch. Next we have Spirits of Chogoris. This is Warp Charge 6. You pick a unit within 18 inches and it has -1 to hit until your next psychic phase. Also -1 leadership, but nobody really cares about that. -1 to hit on a really big critical enemy unit could be incredibly handy to have. Say you put this on something scary such as a Knight Crusader, and all of a sudden all of those very nasty guns are nowhere near as threatening as they were the previous turn. It will also make units less effective in close combat, so if you're worried about being hit back hard by an enemy heavy hitter, this can help to mitigate some of the damage. And finally for Warp Charge 6 we have Eye of the Storm. Essentially you roll a dice for every enemy unit within 12 inches of the caster. On a 4-up that takes a mortal wound, or on a 3-up if it has the fly keyword. I'd say this is the only fairly weak spell in the discipline. To be able to deal 2 mortal wounds that you'd get for an average smite, you'd have to have 4 units within 12 inches of the caster. In certain circumstances it could be doable, but by that point you've entirely surrounded your Librarian with the enemy army, and he's probably going to get killed quite quickly. I'd leave this one at home as a damage dealer and stick with Lightning Core and Smite if you really want to pump out the mortal wounds. All in all, I think that Stormspeaking is a really good discipline. I'm very impressed that I can actually see decent uses for 5 out of the 6 powers. That's very rarely the case with Games Workshop psychic disciplines, so well done to them. I'm not sure any of them are game-breakingly strong, but they're all decent, and I could certainly see a Librarian helping out White Scar's heavy hitters coming in from reserves. Time for the stratagems then, and along with the psychic powers, this is another area where the book really shines. Firstly, we have Windswift for 2 CP. This is essentially a movement buff. You get to pick one unit that you've just moved, and you get to move it again. So with a fast unit such as a bike squad, you would have this going like 34 inches across the board in one turn. Could be incredibly useful if you absolutely have to claim an objective, or to get a buffing character all the way across the board to buff a different set of your units. The stratagem prevents you from shooting, using psychic powers, or charging, so it's literally just a movement buff. I wouldn't use it too often, but it'll allow you to make plays that were otherwise impossible without it, so it's worth keeping in the back of your mind. Next up is Lightning Debarkation. This one I mentioned quite a bit in my Land Raider and Transport Vehicle reviews. This essentially lets you move with your vehicle and still get the unit inside of it out after it has moved, though it can't charge in the same turn. It costs 1 CP and it's essentially very similar to the Impulsor rule. Now this one's best value comes out of getting close range shooting units right into the face of the enemy. Like I said, Impulsors can do this for free, so you're going to be looking at using it on Repulsors, Land Raiders, Rhinos and Razorbacks, and Storm Ravens. Could be very nasty to get a full 10-man squad of Hellblasters out right in the face of the enemy, or jump out a bunch of Assault Centurions out of a Land Raider Crusader to get to work on the enemy with those Hurricane Bolters and Flamers from very close range. It's a very good way to get slow-moving units like Terminators, Aggressors or Centurions up the board in combination with one of their transport vehicles. You could get these guys very, very close to the enemy turn 1, combined with an advance, so they'll have to deal with them unless they want to be charged by something very nasty in your next turn. Next up is Fierce Rivalries, and you play this when you make the first charge of your turn. It costs 1 CP, and you roll 3d6 and you get to choose the best 2. This is a really solid buff on your charge. It really raises the chance of you getting a 9-inch charge out of reserve, particularly combined with other buffs such as the Plume of the Planesrunner or the Ride the Wind power. I'd strongly considering using this whenever you absolutely need a charge to go off. Next we have Strike for the Heart. This is a 2 CP stratagem that will allow a White Scars unit to consolidate D3 plus 3 inches if they're a regular infantry model, or D6 plus 6 inches if every model has a move characteristic of at least 10 inches in the unit. Now for 2 CP, I'd only consider it if you got to access the D6 plus 6 inch consolidate bit. Having a bigger consolidate can be absolutely massive after you've fought in the fight phase, as it means that you could move a long way to drag other enemy units that don't want to be in combat into combat, such as say if you charge in, kill a bunch of infantry screens, and then you get to consolidate into an enemy tank afterwards to stop it from shooting. You could also potentially use this boosted movement to wrap an enemy unit so it can't fall back and has to remain in close combat with you. It is a bit pricey at 2 CP, so you have to weigh up whether or not this benefit is going to actually be worth it. If you can get away with just using your normal consolidate, then it'll save you CP. Moving on, we have Encirclement, which is another great 1 CP stratagem. During deployment, this will let you set up a unit outflanking. It's a way of putting it in reserve, so on turns 2 or 3 it can come in within 6 inches of any board edge, but it must be outside of 9 inches of any enemy models. Now this has big pros but some cons. Being able to put a big scary unit in reserve, particularly something that wants to be close to the enemy, could be pretty powerful. Say if you combined it with something like Centurions, who want to be nice and close to use those Flamers and Hurricane Bolters. But you do run the risk of your opponents being able to screen out all of the decent drop zones, so they might have to set up somewhere quite close to your army if they have infantry units locking down the edges of the board. Alternatively, you could use this to put a heavy hitting firepower unit in reserve if you have second turn, to allow it to come on and do a bit of a beta strike on the enemy army. For example, a massive squad of Centurion Devastators with las cannons will get a full burst of firepower off at some optimal targets if they get set up this way, but obviously you have the downside of not being able to shoot with them turn 1 as they'll be off the board. You can also use this on tanks and vehicles, which gives you a lot of tactical flexibility with this. Next we have Butchered Quarry, where if your opponent chooses to fall back from one of your infantry or biker units when they're in close combat with them, then you can pay 1 CP and each model in the squad can make 1 attack at the enemy units before it goes. After that, they can also move an additional 3 inches towards the falling back unit, provided it doesn't bring them within 1 inches of any enemy models. Now this could be a nice little surprise kick for your opponent when they think that their big scary gunline threat has just survived one of your charges, and then they choose to fall back, and you could have the potential of finishing it off with the last few attacks from that squad. Definitely worth bearing in mind, as it will often be a very good use to spend 1 CP for that amount of damage output. Next we have Hunter's Fusillade, 1 CP. This allows you to fire your heavy and rapid fire weapons as if they were assault weapons when the unit advances. As your White Scars, you'll want to be advancing a lot to get into close combat range. This could be useful on something like a big unit of bikes. If you have 6 bikes in a squad, for example, this will net you another 12 bolter shots. It could also be good on other units such as Assault Centurions, who might want to advance to get off their very scary charge, but they might want to shoot with their Hurricane bolters too. Bear in mind that this does stop rapid fire weapons from firing twice for every shot, so you'll only ever get 1 shot out of, say, a bolter. Next we have Born in the Saddle, which is now just going to cause me to disregard what I just said, as this will let a biker unit advance and shoot. So if you're using a biker unit, just use this one instead of Hunter's Fusillade. Then we have Fainting Withdrawal for 1 CP, a unit that falls back can still shoot. In White Scars you might be doing a fair bit of falling back, as you can fall back and then charge again, so being able to fall back, shoot and charge really gets you the maximum amount of utility out of a unit. Could be particularly strong on something that has decent ranged output as well as decent melee output, such as say a Terminator squad with Storm Bolters. Next we have Chogorian Thunderbolts. This allows you to do a similar impact hit that inflicts a mortal wound on a roll of 6 for every one of your charging models that's ended a charge move within 1 inches of an enemy unit. It costs 1 CP, so say with big 10-man units you might get 1 to 2 mortal wounds out of it. I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world, to be honest, as 1 CP for 1 or 2 mortal wounds on a unit that's already just about to take a whole ton of damage is not worth it in my book. Next we have the Eternal Hunt for 2 CP. You use it at the start of a turn when the Assault Doctrine is active, and all pistol and melee weapons get an extra -1 AP if they make a wound roll of a 6 until the start of the next battle round. As this is army wide, it's worth considering. You can only use it once, it costs 2 CP, and yes, if you do have a decent amount of melee units surviving on turn 3, you could think about using this. I think to get proper utility out of this though, you're going to need multiple units in combat at the same time, which might be hard to pull off, as the enemy in general won't want you in combat with them, so will be taking steps to mitigate that and kill your units. Next is Ride Hard, Ride Fast for 1 CP. You can use this on a unit that just advanced, and enemy shooting units get a -1 to hit against that unit until the start of your next movement phase. This is quite interesting because it doesn't have any keyword restrictions, so you could use it on big vehicles that advanced, you could use it on infantry that advanced, and you could use it on daft things like Centurions or Terminators that advanced. Somehow they're riding hard, riding fast while walking very slowly across the battlefield. Could be a useful one for when you're getting some heavy hitting slow moving units into position. Could certainly help your bikes if they're about to advance and charge and are expecting to take more enemy fire in the next turn. And it could be good on a transport if you advance it and then also pop smoke to give it a -2 to hit. Yep, this one's a good one. Next we have Quarry of the Khan, which is a Maelstrom objective one for 1 CP. If your White Scars Warlord is on the field or any first generated tactical objective, this stratagem automatically makes it the Kingslayer tactical objective. I'd say this is absolutely definitely not worth it unless you're certain you will kill the enemy Warlord turn 1, as it will hog a tactical objective slot when you're not really very likely to actually achieve Kingslayer till a fair bit later in the battle. Certainly not worth it apart from in very rare circumstances. And finally, for the unique White Scars ones, we have a Mighty Trophy. You can use this when a White Scars unit kills the enemy Warlord in close combat, and for the rest of the game, your White Scars are fearless. Now this isn't awful, it might save you a casualty or 2, but in general Marines don't suffer too hard from morale. If you're taking a few big units, then it's worth considering just in case you do roll poorly on a morale test or 2. Finally, for the stratagems that are the same in all books, we've got Khan's Champion. This can give your sergeant either a mastercrafted weapon, digital weapon, head takers trophies or Stormwrath bolts. I'd say the best out of these is the mastercrafted weapon, which could be potentially used to make an aggressor's Boltstorm Gauntlets damage 2 or an Intercessor Thunderhammer damage 4, both of which are good things. Tempered by Wisdom for 1 CP allows you to generate a second Warlord trait for your Warlord. This is particularly potent in a White Scars mix, because as we looked at the Warlord traits earlier, a lot of them are very strong melee buffs. You could build an absolute monster with 2 Warlord traits, such as say taking the plus D3 attacks one, and also the +1 to hit and wound against vehicles one. Combine that with a damage increasing relic, and you can clock your character up to an insane amount of damage potential. The only downside of this is that you might well be throwing away your Warlord if you choose to engage too closely to the enemy, so it's a bit of a give and take. Finally, we have Gift of the Khans, which is the stratagem for White Scar's successors to allow them to take one of the Relics of Chogoris, one of the special White Scar's actual relics, so could well be worth considering if you want one of those. So now we've looked through all of the options available to us, let's take a look at an example White Scar's list that uses some of the stronger units in the book to give us a nasty melee-centered army. Now I'm not going to lie, I've had quite a lot of fun making this list. It doesn't have a ton of ranged fire support, but it's got 5 really big, nasty melee threats to ram down the enemy's throat. I took 2 battalions of pure White Scars to give us enough CP for all the relics, warlord traits and stratagems we need. And I started out with a pair of very fighty smash captains. First we have a biker captain with a Thunderhammer Storm Shield, Master of Snares and the Wrath of the Heavens bike. This is to ensure that he gets exactly where he needs to in the enemy army. Hopefully he can charge into something, do a lot of damage to it, and then the enemy won't be able to pull out of close combat with him with the Master of Snares rule. So he should keep it locked up, keep himself safe, and then he can disengage and charge something new the next turn. Next we've got the actual Warlord, who is a jump captain with a Thunderhammer Storm Shield, who I've just loaded a whole load of fighty buffs onto. So he's got the Chogorian Storm, that's the plus D3 attacks when he charges, so we'll have an average of 7 Thunderhammer swings when he attacks. He's got Hunter's Instincts, so that's the +1 to hit and wound against vehicles. I would make that the extra Warlord trait that he picked, so he could choose something else in a matchup that didn't have many vehicles or monsters. And he's got a Mastercrafted Thunderhammer, so that'll be hitting at damage 4 as per standard, and then turn 3 or later it'll be hitting at damage 5. With a bit of luck, that 130 point model could solo a knight in 1 turn. Next we have a big unit of Assault Centurions. They've got Hurricane Bolters and Flamers. Depending on the matchup, they might either start on the board or outflank with the stratagem to set them up in outflank. If they do catch anything in melee, then that's very good, and they certainly could if the enemy is foolish enough to put something that they can charge within striking range of the board edge. But otherwise, if they don't get the opportunity to charge, then they'll just wander around laying down 72 bolter shots per turn while being quite tough, which isn't a bad use. Following on from that, I've included 10 Terminators with Storm Bolters. These would deep strike either turn 2 or turn 3, depending on what I needed most. If I wanted more AP on the Storm Bolters, then they come down turn 2 when we're in Tactical Doctrine, and unload 40 Storm Bolter shots with AP -1 on the enemy. They could then use the stratagem to give them a boosted charge, and they could drop down with the Librarian, who we're coming on to later, who can also help out their charge. If they do drop down turn 3, however, then all of those Power Fists are going to be damaged D3 +1, so an average of 3 damage per successful attack. There isn't really very much that's going to want to tank that amount of Power Fist attacks. That's 30 damage 3 Power Fist attacks on the charge. Next we have a full unit of Vanguard Veterans, so that's 10 jump back Vanguard Veterans, each armed with a chainsword and a storm shield, and one has a Thunderhammer to provide a little bit of anti-tank threat. Again, these could either start on the board out of line of sight, or drop down either turn 2 or turn 3. With all of those strength 4 attacks, they'll quite happily chew through hordes, and with those storm shields they're quite tanky, so unless your opponent does actually focus them down, then the next turn they'll be able to leave combat and tie up something that the opponent really doesn't want to be tied up. They're a good nuisance unit, and they're not really all that expensive at just over 200 points. To fill out the battalions, I've gone cheap on the troops, with 6 units of scouts with bolters. These are just to give me board control, a little bit of anti-infantry firepower, and to claim objectives. In this list I opted to save the extra points on the troops and put as much as possible into the hard-hitting punches that the White Scars can give you. We have a Thunderfire Cannon to lurk in the back lines. This will help whittle down some chaff. Could think about using Tremor Shells to slow down a key enemy unit. Killing some enemy troops units could be key for getting a charge off on something nasty with the heavy hitters. Moving on to the 2nd Battalion, we've got a Librarian with Jump Pack and Plume of the Planesrunner. He would most likely drop down with either the Terminators, Vanguard Vets or Centurions to give them +2 inches to their charge, and I'd tailor the other power based on the matchup. I'd strongly consider the no Overwatch power if I was fighting something that had a lot of Overwatch, say like a Knight, but as I said, the Stormspeaking discipline is all amazing, so you could really tailor which power it is battle on battle. He also has Plume of the Planesrunner, so if he does get off that psychic power, then one of these units will be charging out of reserve on just a 6-inch charge. so if you are feeling risky you might not even need to deploy that very nice White Scar stratagem that boosts charges. We then have a Lieutenant with a jump pack and Teeth of Terror. He's a nice cheap character who can give some reroll 1s to one of the fighter units, and the Teeth of Terror is just giving him a 1 CP upgrade to turn him into a pretty horrible melee threat in his own right. He'll be hitting on 2s with 7 attacks on the charge, so he'll absolutely make a nasty mess of any infantry. On the Assault Doctrine, that Teeth of Terror will also be damaged 3. Very nasty indeed. And to round off the list, we've got some Bikers, because of course you want some Bikers in the White Scars list. And the Scout Bikers have actually very good firepower for the points. With shotguns and the Sergeant having a Storm Bolter, they'll put out 20 bolter shots for a 71 point unit each, which really isn't bad at all. The fact that they can also advance and charge means that they could tie up an enemy unit that's a very long way away from them. So these guys give the list some mobility and options, and also the ability to clear some troops out before the big punches drop turn 2. I'm actually not so very far away from being able to run a similar list to this in terms of models, so I might well give White Scars a run if I feel like playing an army that's a bit more dynamic. Overall, my main gripe with the White Scars is that their doctrine comes too late. I think the Games Workshop should seriously consider having the option to start in Assault or Tactical Doctrine to better balance out the chapters. Their strats are very good. They have solid Warlord traits, decent relics, and a very good psychic discipline. I could happily see the White Scars being run as successor chapters as well, because the actual White Scars trait is very good, but it could be more useful to pick up something such as +1 to advance and charges, or Master Artisans, or Whirlwind of Rage to boost their already considerable melee output. I have a feeling that we will certainly see some White Scars detachments in competitive lists in the future, though I think that they might struggle to actually dominate tournaments as a pure army. I think that there's just more to be gained by having some White Scars and then some of something else that's better tailored to providing some ranged fire support and keep the White Scars for the close combat heavy hitting units. I'd love to be proved wrong, however, so if anyone knows any White Scars lists that have done well in a competitive setting, please let me know. That means we're now up to date with all of the Codex supplement reviews. So far I've done one for Iron Hands, Raven Guard and Ultramarines, and now White Scars. I'll certainly be looking to do the Salamanders and Imperial Fists when we get those supplements. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more Space Marine content over the next few weeks. If I've got anything wrong in the video, please let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.